Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the 2012 World Dairy Expo. Today's seminar, Planning for Change, Transitioning the Family Farm, is sponsored by EW Nutrition. EW Nutrition is a worldwide animal agricultural company servicing all livestock areas around the world. The speaker today is Elizabeth Rumley, JD LLM. She's a staff attorney with the National Agricultural Law Center. Elizabeth is an attorney on staff at the National Agricultural Law Center. Her research focuses on the legal issues in animal agriculture. Her position at the center has taken her across the U.S. to talk with both agricultural and non-agricultural audiences about legal issues facing our industry. This seminar has been approved for continuing education credits from the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists and the American Association of Veterinary State Boards, RACE. Forms are available in the back of the room if you'd like to qualify for this. I would like to ask everyone to silence their cell phones now as we welcome Elizabeth to the podium.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to EW Nutrition and to the World Dairy Expo for having me here today. I really appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to talking with you. I understand this is something where there are a lot of questions, and if you wouldn't mind keeping your questions until the end, I believe there's a period of time at the very end that we can cover them. Let me tell you a secret about lawyers. The scariest thing in the world is to tell a lawyer you have 40 minutes to talk and then not put a clock anywhere in the room. So if I start going over and you're worried you're not going to have time for questions, let me know, okay? I tried to make it short, but lawyers short, it just doesn't work sometimes. Today I want to talk to you about planning for the future. And it's really nice to see so many people that are interested in this topic, because a lot of times it's something that doesn't come up until very late in the day, if at all. But it is something that's very important to agriculture and very important to dairy as well. In 2007, according to the Ag Census, the average age of an American farmer was 57. Dairy is actually a little bit better than that, a little bit lower. The average age of a dairy farmer was 51 and a half. But look at the statistics for dairy specifically. 62% of dairy farmers in the United States are over the age of 45. 34% are over the age of 55. And 14% of dairy farmers in the United States are still farming at the age of 55 or older. This is something that, as you look at the ag census, at the difference in the ag censuses, the age keeps moving up. And it's something that we need to think about as early as possible and address as early as possible so that the young farmers coming in have enough time to develop their relationships with suppliers and to develop the business know-how and the knowledge to take over the farm into the next generation. Here's the number one question, the most important question for an exiting farmer, for a parent generation to think about, is what do you want to happen? Do you want to transfer your farm as a group of assets, a milking machine, 200 acres of land, a farmhouse? Or do you want to transfer your operation as an operation, as something that can be continued into the next generation? If you want to transfer your property, as assets, it's pretty easy to do. You have a will, you have an estate plan. It's a little bit more difficult when you're talking about a viable business that can be transferred successfully into the coming years, into the next generation. For that, you need to have what we're going to be talking about today, more of a transition plan, where you transfer not only the assets itself, but you transfer the business and the know-how and the transitioning itself. What's the difference? I have them divided up into three categories for both transitioning the assets and transitioning the business. But before I get started, let me tell you another secret about lawyers. It's very difficult to get a straight answer sometimes. And even more so when you're talking about transition planning. I wish I could stand up here and tell you this is what you need to do. Check off on a checklist, you need to do this, 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 and this. and your children and grandchildren will be able to farm. But it's not that easy. In fact, that's impossible to do because every family is different. Every operation is different. Something that works for you wouldn't work for your neighbor. Something that works for you wouldn't necessarily work for your brother and sister. So what I'm going to talk about today is more of theory of things to think about. The things that you're going to want to think about and consider if you're the parent generation, talk about with your spouse. Think about, talk about with your children. And after you talk about it and think about it, go to a lawyer. Set this estate plan and set this transition plan into place. The first thing I want to talk about are taxes. It's really good to see so many people here and more coming in all of the time. Two of the things people don't want to talk about are death and taxes. We're going to cover both of those today. Taxes that might affect your estate planning. There's a couple of them that I have here. You're talking about federal estate taxes. In some cases, we're talking about state estate taxes. And we're also talking about federal gift taxes. The federal estate tax is a tax that the federal government puts on assets that are transferred through after somebody dies, through somebody's estate. Only estates that are larger than the unified credit have to pay this tax. So it's not on every estate. It's just on the larger ones. In 2011 and 2012, for people who died during this year, the unified credit is $5 million a person. So somebody can pass on $5 million in assets. After 2012, so in just a couple months, if nothing happens in Congress, then it will drop down to $1 million a person. As you can see, this can make an incredible difference. For a couple, this is the difference between being able to pass on $10 million in assets and being able to pass on $2 million without being affected by the estate tax. The federal estate tax, according to the IRS, affects about 2% or less of Americans that pass away. However, in agriculture, because it's such a resource-rich area and things cost a lot, that number is proportionately higher. So it's very important, if you're involved in agriculture, to be aware of this happening and be aware of the consequences for your estate. For those estates that have to pay federal estate taxes, only the value of the estate above that line, above the unified credit, will be taxed. So if you have a $5.5 million estate and pass away this year, you will only be taxed on the $500,000 that's above that line. Everything up to there is able to be passed tax-free. In 2011 and 2012, the unified credit, the estate tax rate for the amount above the unified credit is 35%. Again, if Congress doesn't act, if nothing changes, it will be 55%. So it will be taxed at 55% of everything over that $1 million mark. That's if Congress doesn't do anything. In 2012, a single person can pass down $5 million in cash and or property with no estate planning and without paying federal taxes. A married couple can pass down $10 million if they both pass in this year. For 2013, who knows what Congress will do, but the way things stand right now, it will be lowered significantly. So I said that there are 3 different kinds of taxes that I was going to talk about that have the possibility to impact estate planning. And the next is state estate taxes. This is something different than the federal estate taxes. It's just more taxes, but on the state level. I have a map up there that shows where state estate taxes are in place. Not every state imposes these taxes on the people who pass away in their state. In fact, it's about 23 states and the District of Columbia that have them in some form, these state estate taxes. If you don't live in one of those states, this is not something you need to worry about. Next, I want to talk a little bit about federal gift taxes. If you give somebody a lot of money or property, you might have to pay what's called a federal gift tax. But most gifts are not subject to the federal gift tax. If you give somebody a Christmas present or a birthday present, that's probably not going to be subject to the gift tax. It only takes place in gifts that are above the threshold of $13,000. It's called the annual exclusion. And you can give that gift to as many people as you want. But if you exceed that annual exclusion, if you give somebody more than $13,000 this year, then that amount above the $13,000 is then applied to your $5 million credit. Clear as mud, right? Let's talk a little bit more about it. Joe and Sue have one son, Bill. They would like to give him a gift of money or property. When does the federal gift tax kick in? Joe and Sue can each give Bill up to $13,000 a year, or at least for this year. That totals $26,000 because 13 from Joe, 13 from Sue. They can also give their daughter-in-law that amount of money as well, and anyone else that they want to, up to the maximum of $13,000. So you can see when you're talking about giving this property and this money to different people, this can be a way to transfer assets, little by little by little. But what if Joe and Sue really like their son and have a lot of extra cash hanging out, and they decide to give Bill $500,000 for 3 years in a row? Does anyone want to take a shot at answering that one? That's okay. They exceeded the annual exclusion by a significant amount every year, for a total of $1,422,000 over the 3-year span. That amount of money will be subtracted from the $5 million that they can give. You see why you want to talk to a lawyer about this? These things change from year to year to year. And as long as Congress keeps putting in these short-term fixes, it's important to review your estate plan with a lawyer as the laws change, because things can change very significantly. And something that works for you and works for your business this year, it's very possible will be a bad idea come January 1st. So now that we've talked about taxes, I want to talk a little bit about tools that can be used to transfer property, to transfer assets. If you die without any form of an estate plan, if you die without a will, if you die without a trust, that's okay. Your property will still be given to somebody. It will be given to whoever your state says it should be given to if people die without a will, without an estate plan. Is that what you want? Who do you want making the decisions about your property? You or somebody in your state legislature? That's the question you need to ask yourself when deciding whether to handle estate planning now or to put it off until a later date. Some tools that are in place for transferring assets I have listed up on the board. The one that everybody knows about is a will. It's still a very valid way to form an estate plan. And it transfers the assets upon death. So after you die, what your will, once it's probated, the parameters of your will are put into place. And it typically must be put through a probate court process. Some states, if you don't have property, then you don't have to put it through probate. But I'm assuming for those of you in this room, probate is a very strong probability. Another option for transferring assets is called a trust. And a trust doesn't have to go through probate because the assets are put into the trust as soon as it's formed. And then the assets don't belong to me. My house, my land, my equipment wouldn't belong to me. It would belong to Elizabeth Rumley Trust. It changes the ownership of the trust, of the assets themselves. And another option for transferring assets is to form a business organization. Either an S Corp or an LLC are the most typical options what we're talking about now. And you may transfer business assets to be owned by the organization, by the business. So Elizabeth Rumley Farms. And the business itself, like Mitt Romney said, is a person, is something separate than you. Because it's separate, it doesn't die when you do. It will continue as long as there are assets in the business, as long as the business is continued. Those assets can stay there. And business organizations are typically not something that you use exclusively. Usually you have either a will or a trust in addition to the business organization to transfer not only the business assets, but to transfer your personal assets as well. The most important part, and if you take nothing else away from what I'm saying to you today, is talk to an attorney. Things change. Your decisions change and the laws change. And the attorney is going to be the one who can help work you through this. But before you go and talk to an attorney, on the pieces of paper, the sheets of paper that they handed out, there's some links down at the bottom. I would like you to go to those links, and you can fill out books, you can fill out questionnaires about how you want the transition plan to take place. Because the most important thing is that it's something that you are happy with, something that is right for your family. And if you fill this out and you make these decisions before you go to a lawyer, it's going to cost you a lot less than if you're sitting in his office thinking about all of the things that you want to do and making the decisions while the clock is running. Personal information that you're going to want to give to your attorney. You will be asked for very personal information. The problem of the unmentioned child. In many states, if you have a child that you don't mention to the attorney, that you don't mention in the will, that child can take the amount from your estate that they would receive under the state's plan. Because the judge will look at it, probate will look at it and think, well, maybe they forgot about this kid. So since they're a child, they should be included as well. Have a list of names and relationships of a lot of people. Spouses, ex-spouses, children, stepchildren, children born outside of marriage, living parents, grandparents, all sorts of things. You want to have this list in place before you go and talk to an attorney. Financial information that you should give to your attorney is also very wide-ranging. Anything you own, real property, equipment, animals, insurance policies, leases, livestock, and a list of household items or any personal items that you want to give to somebody specifically. You don't have to say, well, I have, silverware in the drawer. Somebody can take that. But if you have your grandmother's china that you want to give to your daughter, that is something that can be listed or should be listed specifically in the will to avoid problems at a later date. Here's a list of some times where you should update your estate plan. When there has been a change in your life, a personal change, marriage or divorce, birth or death, beginning or ending a business. When there has been a change in the law, this happens all the time, either in the tax law, in the probate law, or in the trust law. These are all times where you should go to your attorney and talk about changing and updating your estate plan so it's working well with what you want in the future. Or if you've changed your mind, if you've decided that you want to do something different, you need to go and talk to your attorney to update your estate plan to meet your needs at that time. This is something that's very difficult to talk about, and even more difficult to think about, whether you're a parent generation or the entering generation. Fairness versus equity. There's two different ways to pass down your assets. You can divide them equally among all children, whether or not they're involved in the farming business, or you can look at what's fair. And that's taking into account the entire situation and thinking about what each child needs in making these distribution decisions. Alternatives for off-farm heirs. Because a lot of people say, well, we're just going to divide it. I have 3 children. They each get a third of my property upon my death. That's one way to do it. And it's a very valid way to do it. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. But just keep in mind how difficult it might be for a entering generation to continue the operation with only 1/3 of the assets that you have been working the operation with. Some alternatives for children that are off-farm heirs that don't work with the operation. They have a job in town, they might move to a different state, whatever it is. Some alternatives include life insurance. The proceeds can go to them, and the assets from the operation, the farm, will stay with the child that's working on the farm. You can form a family corporation and give them shares in that corporation, so they'll receive some proceeds from the farm. If you do that, you might want to think about giving the farming child what's called a right of first refusal, which means the person who's farming has the right to buy those shares before the other children sell them to anyone else. It keeps the farm in the family and the assets in the family. Another option for off-farm heirs, if it's possible, is cash or other liquid assets. I understand that's not always possible, but it is an option. Everything that I've talked about so far is focused on transitioning your assets. I want to take the rest of my time to look at transferring the business itself and things that you need to think about and make decisions on now, before it's too late, while there's still time for things to be put into place. And the first thing you need to think about is, what are your goals? Think about what you want to accomplish through this estate planning process. And you need to rank them. What is the most important to you? What is the most important to your family? Because it's very possible that some of these goals won't work well with others. And in that case, having them ranked and having those decisions made beforehand as to what is most important to you is going to become even more important. Next, you want to give some thought into what you're giving to each individual, what you're giving to each member of the next generation. If you give farmland to a child who has no interest in farming, is that going to continue your operation? Is that going to allow the farm to move on to the next generation? If they have no interest in farming, maybe not. How about if you have a child that has an interest in farming and you decide to give them your farmland? Don't they need the equipment to work that land? Don't they need the cows to put in that dairy? To have a full and complete operation continuing, that might be a goal that you have. You also need to think about if your heirs want or can actually use the things that you're giving to them. If you leave the furniture in your house to a child that lives in New York City, it might not be something that they can use. It might not be something that is useful or that is possible for them to implement into their lives. So this is where you need to talk, the entering generation and the exiting generation, the parent generation and the child generation. Talk about these decisions and talk about them on the front end. Decide as the exiting generation and as the entering generations, talk about your goals. Make decisions yourselves, but also work together in making these overall estate and transition planning decisions and goals. Other things that you need to consider as goals of the older generation. Think about your retirement lifestyle. What do you see yourself doing in retirement? Are you going to stay in the same town where you were born and raised and have worked your entire life? Or do you want to travel? Do you want to do other things? Think about the money that will be needed to sustain that lifestyle. That's something that's important to consider. And also think about the non-farm heirs. Fair or equal? How do you want to pass on your property? And think about where you want to live. Farming is fairly unique in that people live where they work. Do you want to live in the farmhouse where you've been for the last 40 years? Or does the child who is entering into the farming business need to have that closeness to the barns, to the cows, and to the milking machines. If that's the case, where are you going to live? And what money and what lifestyle requirements in those changes will that require? Things to consider as the younger generation. What money is needed to sustain the lifestyle that you want or that you can afford? What do you want to do with the business? In terms of growth, are you somebody who lets the business grow as it grows? Or do you go out and you take more risks? And can the two generations work together on the amount of risk that they're able to take and the amount of risk that they're willing to take? You also want to look at the two generations' attitude toward debt. If you have one generation that's willing to go out and get big loans on the expectation, on the hope that they'll pay off with even bigger returns, but you have another generation who isn't, that's something you need to talk about and you need to come to a decision about before you start farming together. And the younger generation also needs to think about expectations of family time versus work time. With dairy farming, there's not as much of an option to go out and take vacations, and you have to milk the cows when you have to milk the cows. Is that something that's okay with both generations? With getting up in the middle of the night, 24/7, 365 days out of the year? Is that something that's going to be acceptable? Are both generations okay with that? Those decisions have to be talked about, and they have to be made, hopefully, before big concerns happen, before there's an emergency, before something happens where it's too late to discuss it. When you're talking about transferring the business, another thing that's important to consider is the financial viability. Things to consider here include the income of the farm, the amount of the income, and the source of the income. You're also going to want to look at your farm debt structure. Are most of your loans more long-term loans, or are they short-term operating loans that need to be paid back year by year by year? Look at the interest rate that you have on these loans. How much are you paying towards interest? Are you okay with that? Is that something you'd like to change? And it's important that both generations are involved in making these decisions. When your child turned 16, or whatever your age it was that they started driving, did you just say, go on, have a good time? Or did you teach them how to drive before then? Did they have a learning process? That's important to think about because transitioning is the same way, not only for agriculture, but for any business. You can't just drop them into the driver's seat and hope for the best. These decisions and the ownership need to be thought of before it's the only option available, before something happens that they are just dropped in without any knowledge or any experience beforehand. And another thing to consider is family living cost. You're talking about implementing another family into your farm business. So what was once supporting one family is now having to support two, the entering generation and the exiting generation. You're also going to want to think about off-farm employment. Is that something that you're interested in? Is that something that's required? And insurance. Where is it going to come from? How? Who's paying for it? These are all things that you need to think about when you're looking at the financial viability of transferring this operation. And finally, look at the farming and farm or ranch size. My grandparents have about 500 acres in Michigan. And on that 500-acre farm, they were able to raise 9 children and put them through college. I don't think it's possible to do that today with 1 child, let alone 2. Times have changed. The requirements for assets and the requirements for agriculture have changed as well. Think about and talk about, is it possible? And if it's not possible, think about what changes could be made or what changes you would like to make it possible. if continuing the operation is something that's important to you in both generations. And finally, I want to talk about a succession plan itself and things that you need to think about when you're putting together your succession plan. Is the parent generation ready for a partner? And not only are they ready for a partner, are they ready for a partner that they can remember changing their diapers 30 years ago? Can you look at this entering generation as more than just a child? Can you look at them as a full partner? As somebody whose experience and ideas are valid as yours are? Because that's what a partner is. How committed is the child to farming? Is this a, I don't have anything better to do, so I think I want to take over? Or is this an actual commitment? And these decisions have to be made and these things have to be thought about before it's too late. You have to look at, is the business large enough? If you have a 50-cow dairy, it might not be large enough to support 2 families. Might not be large enough to support 1 family. But these are things you need to look at now. Do you have a common vision of your future? How do you want things to happen? How does the other generation want things to happen? Is that the same vision? Can you live and work together? With agriculture so close, between the living and the working, you're going to have 2 families working on the same business. Is that possible? Is your family dynamics, is your family structure going to support that decision? And finally, are the non-farming children supportive? Is this something that has been discussed as a family? And is everybody okay with it? A lot of people say, well, they'll fight it out when I'm dead. Is that what you want your children to do? Do you want those relationships to be scarred for forever, potentially, because this wasn't discussed now? And once you decide to transfer, these are just some different components that you're going to want to look at. The first one is ownership. I think the most important thing that you can do in transferring a business to the next generation is a timeline. To actually sit down and figure out, by this point in time, I would like to have this many assets transferred. By this point in time, I would like my son or daughter to be running this part of the operation. Actually put dates to those so you can go back later. You can not only have something to work towards, but you can go back later and see if you met those goals. It gives you another opportunity to talk about this at a later date. It also gives you the ability to have a gradual change in ownership. So you're not selling the entire property at once. It goes little by little by little. And that also helps with estate planning. Remember those gift taxes that I was talking about earlier? If you transfer it little by little by little, it helps bring the estate level and the estate amount down. You're also going to want to think about the inheritance or your will, your trust, whatever your estate plan is, and look at your off-farm heirs. We've talked about that a lot today, but it's something that's important to think about. Gifts are another way of transferring ownership. Just remember those gift tax implications that we talked about. This year, the $13,000. Next year, we'll see what that is. And sales. Consider financing options. Is your son or daughter going to go to the bank and get a loan? Is it possible for your son or daughter to go to the bank and get a loan? Can you work at some kind of owner financing or some kind of long-term leases? How about a long-term land contract? Are those options for your family, for your business, for your operation? Questions to consider when you're looking at transitioning management. Look at how management will be split. And this might be a good way to help you transfer the management piece by piece. You can say, okay, well this year, I'm in charge of the dairy, but my son is going to be in charge of the row crop operation that we have running alongside. 5 years down the road, I would like my son to be responsible not only for the row crop, but also for the dairy. This puts in not only a timeline, but it also allows very, so to speak, easy divisions, dividing them by operation. Another option is dividing it the whole farm approach. So everybody helps with everything. Sometimes this gets a little sticky when you have too many cooks in the kitchen, but it works for some people. It is an option. And another option is dividing it by farm activity. One person deals with the marketing, one person deals with the production. However it works for your family, dividing it by activity is another way to do it. You are also going to want a timeline for management transition. And it should start out with the learning phase. I don't know if there's anything worse than deciding to transfer that operation, getting 3 years in, and the son or daughter decides it's not what they want to do. That learning phase will allow them to decide if this is a decision that they want to make. But it's not only the child that you're talking about, it's their spouse and their children. It's their entire family have to make this decision. It's not like farming, and dairy farming specifically is a 9-to-5 job where it doesn't matter where you do it or how it happens. It's a lifestyle. It needs to be a commitment. The other important thing is on the other end of the timeline. There needs to be a completion date, a phase-out date. When is this estate plan, this transition plan, going to be complete? It can't just be, some year down the road. But that doesn't mean that you cannot still, as the exiting generation, it doesn't mean that you can't still be involved in some way. But it does mean that the next generation is, at a specific date, responsible for making these management decisions. It is their responsibility at that point. And I talked about this a little bit, but I want to return to it because it's so important. Looking at someone as your child and having all of those memories and those responses is very different than looking at somebody as your business partner. When you're looking into transitioning the farm, you're not looking at somebody as your child. You have to look at them as a business partner with their own valid concerns and their own responsibilities. Because if you don't, quite honestly, you're setting them up to fail. If you make all of the decisions and you make all of the changes, and the next generation doesn't have any of that responsibility, how are they going to learn? How are they going to make those mistakes, like everybody does? And how are they going to develop it into a business that will be valid and able to continue long term in this changing world, in this changing economy, in this changing agricultural landscape? For those of you in the parent generation that I'm talking to, think about how agriculture has changed just from the time that you started. And try to think about what it's going to look like when your child is sitting in your shoes, when your business partner is sitting in your shoes. And these are decisions that they need to be working with, and discussions need to be had. Because one thing there isn't a timeline on is death or illness or disability. I think everybody, whether they're involved in agriculture or not, knows somebody that had a serious illness, had cancer, that died before their time, so to speak. That's something you need to think of when you say, well, I'll just deal with my transition planning next week, because nobody's promised next week. And that's important when you are planning and making these decisions on bringing in the next generation. It needs to be done now. Not only will that allow you the time to put in place an estate plan and a transition plan that you're happy with, but it will also allow the next generation time to work their way into the farm before, God forbid, something happens. The next thing that you need to think about is income and labor. How will income and labor be split? There's several different ways where you can do that. You can either do it by enterprise, so one person works on the dairy, one person works on the row crop, one person works on whatever. You can give shares. Those shares can change as the younger generation has worked into the operation. That's a possibility. You can have wages for both of you. You make this much, you make this much, doesn't matter what else, nothing else matters, just wages. Or some combination. Again, this is something that's going to be important for you and your family to talk about and to think about, because it's a decision that's right for you. It doesn't need to be right for anybody else. And again, with the timelines. Think about a timeline for the split of income and labor. The income for the entering generation might be low to start with. But as more management and more responsibilities are put on that other generation, it might need to switch. And finally, think about a job description for both of you. Have it written down. Have it something that you can refer to, something that can be changed if necessary, but something that both of you understand and both of you are happy with. And finally, how do you accomplish this? Hold regular business meetings, not only with the on-farm child, but also with the off-farm child, so they understand what's going into this operation. Talk about it and then write it down. How many of you have been in a situation where you remembered saying something quite differently than somebody else remembered hearing it? There you go. I don't think anyone in this room can say that they haven't been in that situation. That's why you have lawyers, right? Write things down, because that way you have something to refer to later on and say, well, this is what we agreed to. Both of us are literally on the same page. Make sure that these things are written down and communicated. You also want to share with non-farm family members. This is to help cut off any discussions now, so that everybody knows what the parent generation's wishes are. Everybody knows what they want. You want to improve communication skills. This is where the meetings come in. And also recognize differences between you. You are not your child is not you. You are not your parent, and your parent is not you. You have different dreams, different goals. You're at different parts of your lives. So you need to recognize that and work that into the meeting and work that into the decisions. Don't make assumptions. It goes back to the you are not your parent, you are not your child. Don't assume you know what they mean. Ask. And if you don't understand, ask again. And then write it down. Update the business arrangement as needed. Management participation is learning. And include timelines. Again, you want to work with an attorney, somebody who will help you work through this and help you the best that they can deal with the legal aspects of transitioning this operation. Surprises cause problems. Surprises not only now, but surprises after the parent generation has passed. They cause family problems. They cause significant issues. The most important thing, communicate. Talk with your spouse, talk with your children, talk with your parents, talk with everyone that is involved in the operation. Because if you don't talk, if you don't have those discussions now, those discussions are going to be had at a later date. You're not eliminating the discussions. You're just putting them at a time when somebody has to deal with not only the loss of a parent or the loss of a child and running an operation, but they would have to deal with those decisions as well. Some other resources that are available. The first one is specifically for those of you who might not have a child that's interested in continuing the operation. If you would like your operation to continue and you don't have interest from the next generation, the National Farm Transition Network might be an option for you. The Beginning Farmer Center at Iowa State has a ton of resources that are available to help with your transition plan. They also have workshops that they put on in different parts of the country. Additionally, your local extension office has information that's available. And Ag Transitions, along with the other 2 or 3 options I gave you on that sheet, those are all workbooks or websites that will help you put together your transition plan. It asks the questions, and you're able to fill them out. Think about it, make these decisions among your family and yourselves, and fill them out. That way you can take that book to the lawyer and say, this is what I'd like to do. And you won't have to pay for all that prep work. Another option, another resource that's available is the National Agricultural Law Center. That's where I work, and I want to talk just a couple minutes about what it is that we do. We are a research and information center dealing with agricultural law. Most of our information is available on our website, freely available. And it's nationalaglawcenter.org. If you look up there, it says research by topic. Well, clicky thing doesn't work. Research by topic. When you click there, it will take you to what we call reading rooms. And the reading rooms are lists, there's 50 or so different reading rooms. And they talk about different areas of agricultural law. Everything from pesticides to nutrition programs to biosecurity and animal welfare. Pretty much anything you can think of. When you click on one of those reading rooms, for this example is estate planning reading room, you click on the reading room and it brings up a list of resources. The first thing you find is an overview. And the overview talks about how that area of agricultural law has developed, what laws you're going to be thinking about, what issues are important for, in this case, estate planning. It's going to have a list of major statutes, usually major federal statutes, as well as their regulations. If you ever have problems going to sleep, I highly recommend reading regulations. It'll knock you out 2 minutes flat. That does deserve a round of applause right there. Additionally, there's a case law index. It has important cases. I would not recommend as a producer reading cases, regulations, unless you actually have to. But a lot of this other information, all of this information actually, is not aimed at lawyers. It's available for anybody. And the way it's written, especially the overviews and a lot of the other information on our site, it's written for anybody to understand. You don't have to have gone to school for way too many years to look at this stuff. There's also center research publications, which are things written by staff attorneys on center. There's Congressional Research Service reports and reference resources. If you're not familiar with the CRS reports, they're actually a very good resource. When somebody in Congress would like information about a specific topic, milk marketing orders, whatever it is, they ask the Congressional Research Service. The CRS will research it and will write a report. Very factual, very neutral. This is what it is. After they write those reports, they send them back to the congressperson who had the question. If they're agricultural, we actually receive them as well. So we have the largest collection, the only collection, of agricultural law CRS reports that are freely available. There's also reference resources, which include everything from governmental agencies to Congress, international resources, and different publications that are important for that area of agricultural law. So if you're interested in learning more about what you need to be thinking about when you're looking for estate planning or when you're considering animal welfare issues, whatever the issue is, go and look at these reading rooms. The resources are available there. With that, I don't know what time it is. I've probably taken up my whole hour. Pretty close, sorry. I got 10 minutes, great. Here's my contact information, and I'm ready for questions.
I just wanted to jump in. My name is Melissa O'Rourke. I'm with Iowa State University Extension on the farm management team. I'm an attorney and work with the Beginning Farmer Center.
Great.
I appreciated you sharing that resource from Iowa State University in the Beginning Farmer Center. The other thing I'd mention for folks is if you go there and go to Add Decision Maker and click on a link for estate and transition planning, we have materials, for example, it's an inventory kind of questionnaire intended to be a tool for people to use and fill out when they're getting ready to do this and take to their attorney or their other professionals. And you can either print it out or it's online with fillable blanks, and feel free to do that. And there's also an article. Number one question I get asked when I make these presentations is, how do you find an attorney who knows about farm, estate, and transition planning? And there's an article that gives you ideas on how to do that.
I highly recommend their website. Iowa State has an amazing program on dealing with transitioning.
Thanks.
Other questions?
The trust versus keeping it in the ownership of the farmland. What pros or cons of putting it in a trust versus keeping it in your own name?
Pros and cons of putting it in a trust versus keeping it in your name. It's very specific to your operation. If you keep it in your name, there's going to have to be some other way to transfer it, so usually by a will. That you deal with probate issues as well. It can take a longer period of time. If you put it in a trust, you're looking at something that's no longer owned by you. If you want to sell that, you're going to have some issues. It's going to take a little bit longer to pull it out of the trust and to sell it and decide where the money's going and everything like that. You're still responsible, you're still in charge of your trust. It doesn't mean that somebody else is going to, have the equipment. You are called the trustee of the trust, which means you're responsible and you have the delegation. It goes to you. But it really depends if that's something you're comfortable with, is having your assets owned by something else. But a trust is a very valid estate planning tool and something that you can use to transition it to the next generation. You definitely want to talk to a lawyer. Say, I'm familiar with these two options, familiar with as many options as possible, trust, will, business organization, and say, with my details, with my understanding, with what I have going on, what is the best option for me?
Is there any difference in taxation?
Some, but not really. Yes, sir.
One thing that you mentioned the trust to bring up too is how much does the exiting generation want to control after they're gone? And there's a lot of trust out there that want to buy the land and keep it in agriculture. And you lose control of a lot of control over the farm when you give to those trusts. You aren't a trustee for them, someone else is. And if you think back, at one time a 50-cow farm was, could provide for family and kids and everything else fine. Now it can't. Because your farm, it might seem big enough to supply a family and kids and all that, or 2 kids. Will it 20, 30, 40 years from now? And how much do you want to have control over your kids, even though you aren't here? So that's something to really to think about.
That's a really good point, and I want to just specify, like you said, there are a lot of different kinds of trusts out there. The kinds of trusts that we were talking about, or that I was talking about, are the ones that you control. Other trusts, conservation trusts, I think is what you were talking about, where they preserve the farmland. That is another option that you can put things in, but it's only an option for specific assets, usually for the farmland itself. But very good point, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And I hope you enjoy your day at the Dairy Expo.
We'd like to thank everybody for coming. I think this is a very timely presentation with everything that's going on right now, with the election coming up, the economy, the healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. I'd urge you all to be proactive in listening to what Elizabeth had to say today. And on behalf of EW Nutrition and the World Dairy Expo, we'd like to thank you for coming to the presentation today. Have a great day.